All right, welcome to Green Mountain CrossFit. My name is Tyler, and I'm going to take you through some CrossFit 101 videos, a couple of things that are going to be really helpful for you to know coming into Green Mountain CrossFit or to any CrossFit gym. There's a couple of things you're going to hear coaches talk about, and it's going to be helpful for you to understand these concepts. These are some basic positions of the body. So one of the first things that we want to talk about is the idea of flexion and extension, and you're going to hear this in reference to lots of different movements and lots of different body parts. The basic idea is that flexion is when any two parts of the body, the angle between those bones is getting smaller, so when the bones are getting closer together. So as I flex my bicep, my elbow moves into flexion and my forearm gets closer to the upper part of my arm. As I extend my arm, the angle between these two bones gets larger. So extension is when bones move away from each other, flexion when they move towards each other. This can apply to any part of the body. So I can have flexion and extension of the elbow, I can have flexion and extension of the knee, I can have flexion and extension of the hip, right? You'll also hear this referred to in regards to the spine. So in the spine, when we talk about flexion, extension, and what we think of as a neutral position, what we're really talking about is the relationship between our hips and our rib cage. So you can see my beautifully illustrated positions here. We've got a couple of different possibilities. We can have a neutral spine. And in a neutral spine, we've got a natural curve. In a hollow position, we're looking for a global flexion of the spine. So all segments of the spine, every vertebrae is involved in this flexion, and it should look like a smooth curve in the spine. The opposite to spinal flexion is spinal extension. In a gymnastics sense, the cue that you might hear is arch. You may also hear this cue relative to squatting. When we talk about loaded positions like squatting or deadlifting, when you hear the cue arch, we're not actually looking for you to arch your back. We're looking for you to find and maintain this neutral position. For a lot of us who live in a very forward-facing, typing, mousing kind of a world, we will tend to be flexed, especially through the upper back, that thoracic spine. So a cue of arch may simply mean that we want you to stand up straight and make sure that your spine is in a neutral position. So flexion and extension apply not only to the spine, but let's talk about some ways that you'll hear them referenced about the hip and about the shoulder. So when we talk about extension of the hip, what we're really talking about is making sure that we're standing all the way up, our hip is neutral, and our legs are pushing straight down towards the ground. Extension of the hip can also translate into walking or lunging or running, where one leg is now extending behind us. So the angle of the hip is getting larger, the leg is moving into extension, the hip is moving into extension. This happens primarily through some of the muscles in the back of the body. So the butt being a major, or the glute max being a major extender of the hip. Hamstrings also contribute. You will hear cues like squeeze your butt or stand tall. When you hear those things, what we're really looking for is that nice straight line through the center of your body, through the midline of your body, the hip, and the leg. So with the shoulder, it gets a little bit more complex. Shoulder flexion is any time the arm comes in front of you, just like hip flexion is any time the knee or the leg comes up in front of you. Shoulder extension is any time the arm goes behind you, just like hip extension involves the leg moving behind the body. Shoulder flexion can range all the way up through this overhead position. Shoulder extension, if you have really flexible shoulders, can also range all the way up through that overhead position. So they meet kind of in the middle at the top. In front is flexed, behind is extended. Not only can my joint be in flexion or extension, but my shoulder blades on my back have quite a bit of movement to them as well. They can elevate, which means I can shrug them up. They can also depress, which means I can pull them down. They can retract, I can squeeze them back into the middle of my spine, and they can protract, I can pull my shoulders forward around the sides of my rib cage. Other shoulder cues that you'll hear are going to refer to rotational capacity at the joint. So not only can we move in all these directions that we've already talked about, we can also rotate through the shoulder joint. Rotation becomes important because it's part of how we create stability in a joint, particularly in the shoulder and in the hip joints. You'll also hear when you're working with a barbell or a pull-up bar or something of that nature, you may hear us talk about bending or breaking the bar. So if I had a chunk of dry spaghetti in my hand, I would snap the dry spaghetti so that it broke up in this top range, rather than spinning it and breaking it down towards the floor. So break the bar always refers to external rotation. You're going to hear that when we talk about pressing movements. You'll also hear that when we talk about vertical pushing or pulling movements. So a strict press overhead or a pull-up coming down from an overhead position. Related to the hips, you'll hear that rotation referenced also. So if I start to push my knee out over my pinky toe versus letting it rotate inside of my big toe, this is that external rotation. Here I'm talking about screwing the feet into the ground is a common cue that you'll hear. You may also hear spread the ground apart. So imagine that you're standing on a crack in the earth and you're trying to spread the earth apart as wide as you can. Also, knees out. This is a cue that's commonly overdone. So a knees out cue means that I want external rotation at the hip so that as I squat, my knees track in a straight line over my pinky toes. If the inside of my foot comes off the ground because I'm pushing my knees out so far, that's a movement error. That's a mistake that we don't want to make. Our foot should remain flat on the ground. One of my favorite cues that you'll hear when we're talking about almost any movement, you're going to hear this shouted in any CrossFit gym, anywhere that you go, possibly in other gyms also, you'll hear people yell, "Get tight, stay tight, brace." What the hell does that mean, right? These are cues that refer to maintaining a position with your spine. So the role of your abdominal muscles, the role of the trunk of your body is really to stabilize your spine. It's to resist movement, to resist extension, to resist flexion, or to resist rotation through the spine. So when we're talking about getting tight, we're talking about really trying to engage and thinking about maybe shrink wrapping all of your muscles in towards your spine to maintain the relationship between your rib cage and your hips. Other cues that you might hear that are going to be helpful to know: chest up, or sometimes you hear us talk about an angry gorilla position, especially with our kids' classes. This is another cue to get us out of that forward flexed position. So what we're really looking for is a nice proud chest, but a neutral spine. So rib cage and hips stay stacked on top of each other. That covers a lot of our basic cues, basic positions, flexion and extension, all of the various shoulder blade movements, and some of the basic spinal positions. Hopefully that's helpful for everybody as you come through on-ramp, as you come into your first classes, as you come in to check out our program. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks, and we'll see you at the gym.